my pleasure to welcome everyone here tonight to PCE's Prelude, setting the stage for Paris at Midnight, our sold-out show on November 9th. I am honored to share this little Zoom screen with a group of extraordinary individuals. We have here, and perhaps you can wave as I mention your name, we have here with us tonight Harry Cooper, the ever-busy, much sought-after senior curator and head of modern art at the National Gallery of Art. Harry just got back from Houston, where he opened a new exhibit on Philip Guston at the museum, the very fine Museum of Fine Art in Houston. So welcome back home, Harry. We have with us also Drew Petersen. Yay! Winner of so many awards that I really can't go down the entire list, but it does include the 2018 Avery Fisher Career Grant and the winner of the 2017 American Pianists Award. And if that is not enough, and if you don't know Drew, you need to know that he was presented at Carnegie Hall when he was 5 years old. He is slightly older now, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that later this evening. We also have joining us tonight David Jones, PCE's principal clarinetist, who's also principal clarinet at the Kennedy Center Opera House Orchestra. He plays with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the Lyric Opera of Chicago, Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. Quite simply, he is the best. And we're delighted to have him with us tonight. And of course, at the heart and soul of Post-Classical Ensemble, we have our very own founder, music director, conductor, Ángel Gil Ordonez. And now I'd like to turn the program over to our moderator, Harry.
Thank you, Michelle. It's so exciting to be involved with this. I am usually buried in the Art Museum, the National Gallery offices, and I love music. I'm amateur saxophonist, clarinetist, and this is like a dream come true. So I will be your host, and we're going to move through the program kind of backwards, actually. We're dealing with Paris in the 1920s, and so the subtitle is Jazz and Surrealism in the 1920s. It could really be jazz and classical music and dance and film and Dada and Surrealism and Primitivism in the 1920s. So very ambitious. And we're just going to pick our way through some very important highlights, cultural highlights of that decade. In Paris, it was a time, as you probably know from, say, Woody Allen's film, Midnight in Paris, and Ángel did a very good job of just barely avoiding that title for, I'm sure, for copyright reasons. But, you know, the Woody Allen film evoked that era where we had American expats, Richard Stein, Hemingway, the Fitzgeralds, mixing with French artists and writers and musicians, mixing it up and in every way. The Roaring Twenties really in Paris, if you will. Of course, it was different from the Roaring Twenties here. Europe had endured the war, the Great War, on its own soil, and so there was. You know, there was trauma and there was relief, and just made for a fascinating cultural moment and a big moment for jazz, really, which is a big part of the program tonight. Jazz coming into Europe, even before records came to Europe, coming in with a musician who happened to be named James Reese Europe, the black band leader who came to Europe during the war with the Harlem Hellfighters, and he marched his marching band throughout Europe, playing marching music, patriotic music, but also syncopated music, blues, and started an amazing vogue for jazz in Europe. So by the 1920s, that's really in full force, with people starting to come over to Europe, like Josephine Baker, the dancer, Sidney Bechet, the great jazz musician, and we'll hear from and about both of them in the course of this. We'll also see some clips of an amazing film, dance, music collaboration that we're going to feature, called Entre'act, intermission, it means. And we'll talk about that. But first, we'll start at the end before we get to the Entre'act, the intermission, which is the beginning. This is very Dada. And so starting with the Maurice Ravel Piano Concerto in G major, he wrote at the end of the decade between 1929 and 31, and I'm going to let Drew take over here, but Ravel had just had a U.S. tour, right, and was beginning to explore lots of different kinds of music. So over to Drew. Tell us and show us.
Thank you, Harry, and that's a perfect segue, because I'm thinking to myself, this process of, first of all, reviving my relationship with this incredible, iconic piece, because it is iconic. There's really nothing quite like it, even among Ravel's pieces. He's ambitious, let's put it that way. He I feel is doing a lot of what we are going to be doing on November 9th together, taking from so many different influences, distilling, making it his own, responding to them, and creating a masterpiece out of it. In 22 minutes, he really kind of gives us the world. I think that's a 1010 Wins New York radio station headline, but it could be this. The same could be said about the Ravel Concerto. To your point, Harry, he was in the USA. This was actually kind of news to me. I learned this relatively recently, that Ravel actually went to America at all and toured around with his work and performing and meeting many people. If we might call him, I guess, a Parisian in America, the opposite of the American in Paris, Gershwin. So there's a little bit of that going on. And one of the things that I found from Ravel's tour, a little quote from him, and now we have to be careful with Ravel. We want to hear from him, of course, but he can be a little opaque and a little mysterious. And sometimes you'll see he likes to contradict himself. He likes to not quite give a straight answer. But Ravel did say about his tour in America, the most captivating part of my tour was seeing jazz as its rich and, seeing American jazz in its rich and diverting rhythm. Jazz is very rich and a vital source of inspiration for modern composers. And I'm astonished, and this is Ravel taking, that so few Americans are influenced by it. Well, this was in the 20s, of course. I guess we were just coming into jazz being recognized on the concert stage, people like George Gershwin and company doing all kinds of experiments, if you will, in the concert hall, Rhapsody in Blue, Concerto in F, American in Paris, whatnot. And Ravel was so captured by this rhythm and the melodic kinds of techniques that one can use in jazz that he brought a lot of this rhythm into the concerto. Not to mention jazz being a very influential component of the concerto. Another one, of course, is our surrealist Dada kind of theme that we are going for. Ravel, it's difficult to pin this down because he doesn't speak so directly about surrealism anywhere. However, he does make mention of, for example, the opening of the second movement, this incredible soliloquy for piano solo, concerto for piano, diverse wind, string, percussion instruments. And then for 3 to 4 minutes at the beginning of the second section, the slow section, he writes the most beautiful, incredible, meditative, inspired music. And one would be mistaken in thinking that the music had to have just come to him. How could he have even thought up something like this. And as one is playing through it, as one is listening to it, it's so easy to get lost in the contour of the melody. It's so long, it's so soaring. The accompaniment is at once totally integrated with the melody, but also is a little bit rhythmically offset. It's outlining one 3-beat pattern, the melody is outlining a different 3-beat pattern. So there's a lot of interplay here, but in a very calm, serene kind of way. However, Ravel has a different kind of impression of this material. He says, that flowing phrase about this material I'm describing, how I worked over it bar by bar, it nearly killed me. So there's something to be said about the craftsman in Ravel being so particular in creating this seemingly totally inspired, totally just subconscious, if you will, dreamscape that he's able to do. And there's many moments like this in the concerto. So we have the rhythmic elements, we have the surrealist elements. We even have in all Ravel, we can find his homeland, the Basque country, borderland between France and Spain. And this is also a little difficult to parse because some Basque music sounds a lot like jazz music. And some jazz music sounds a lot like Basque music. In fact, our maestro here and I got into a little discussion about this a couple of weeks ago, about how the second theme in the first movement, when the music after the kind of little fanfare at the beginning with the da-da-dum-bum, da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, that theme, it calms down, you get this kind of serene, meditative, little seductive music. I personally had thought this was a kind of a nod to jazz. There's a little few quotes of Rhapsody in Blue. Perhaps might be the case. But Angel had a really incredible perspective. He said, no, it's that, but it's also the music of Spain. And so I managed to find online a couple of weeks ago some Basque music, some folk music. And lo and behold, there is a video on YouTube, and we can link to this later if we want, or we could share it later, that is purportedly a Basque folk song. And the accompaniment in the guitar is almost identical to the notes that I'm playing at this moment in the Ravel G major. So Ravel is clearly drawing on so many different instruments. There's so many more. We could go on forever. There's a lot of material to cover, but we will be so looking forward to sharing this all with you. I'm really looking forward to participating in a phenomenal presentation of a masterful piece of music.
Thank you, Drew. I love what you were, well, a lot of what you were saying, but this business of just crossing borders, in musical exploration is so important to what we're doing tonight. And it's transatlantic, but also within Europe and between high and low. That actually made me think of what is sometimes said about Porgy and Bess, Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, the song "I Loves You, Porgy," which has many people think elements of Jewish liturgical music, Eastern European music. It becomes impossible to draw these lines, which is so great. Cultural appropriation,
the mastery of these composers' crafts and how they're able to so beautifully discern, and they just know through their experience and through their really, really intense efforts what to put where. This is what amazes me so much about this music. Ravel could have, of course, he can draw upon anything, you write anything down, but the fact that he's able to make it into a cohesive whole, so much so that the piece has taken on a life of its own, and we kind of just, I don't want to say take it for granted, but any classical music lover knows the Ravel G major piano concerto. We know how it goes. And yet, when one starts peeling back the layers, it's fascinating how much is in there, how much is able to be in there.
Yeah. The other thing I want to pick up on is your phrase, almost subconscious dreamscape. And, that gets us immediately into surrealism and the connections that we're trying to draw, and we're not forcing, I think, between music, especially jazz or jazz-informed music, and Dada and surrealism. And, you can draw the connection a lot of ways, but, if if jazz has improvisation, surrealism has free association, flow of ideas, spontaneous, but as Drew points out, really carefully shaped in the end into these amazing works of art, whether it's a painting by Dali or a piece of music by Ravel. So moving along backwards further in our program, we get into jazz proper with David Jones, our wonderful single reed man on clarinet and soprano saxophone, who is going to present a medley of work by Sidney Bechet. And so I'll just say a word to set that up before we hear from David with his thoughts. So Sidney Bechet, I'm sure we all know a little bit about, from New Orleans, one of the great really inventors of jazz, along with Louis Armstrong, especially jazz in the sense of being a great soloist's art coming out of the group improvisations of New Orleans music. Bechet comes to Paris sort of in Josephine Baker's luggage. They're both coming to Paris in 1925 with a show called La Revue Nègre. And yes, the word negro is very much used then. In fact, people refer to the whole period as le tumulte noir, the black tumult, the craze for everything African and African American in particular. Josephine Baker stays in Paris and makes her career there. Sidney Bechet gets into a gunfight and is sent back to the US, and eventually makes it back to Paris for the last decade of his life. But David, what's on your mind? What comes to your mind, and what are you planning for us?
Well, thank you, Harry, and thank you for giving us some background on Sidney Bechet. I think that, one thing that I would say about him as well is that he is one of the original New Orleans musicians that came up with King Oliver, came up with Louis Armstrong, and these other folks. And I think that even as jazz continued to develop, when we had the music of the big bands of Charlie Parker and went in a different direction, I think Bechet really he held, I should say, maybe considering this on my own, but I believe that he really held to that original style of playing. He found a home in France where I believe he felt like he was more welcomed, and he really, I think, flourished there despite his criminal activity that had him banned from the country for a while. He ended up returning and living the rest of his life there until 1959, I believe. I think that, so we're going to present a sort of a medley of some of his better known recordings, including St. Louis Blues, Wildcat Blues, probably a tune called Shake of Araby, which is a fun one, and then this French name Si tu vois ma mère, which he was well known for as well. And we're going to blend those together. He was I believe that his other contribution to the art of playing in small group settings was that he was a dominant player. He asserted himself. He was known to be, I believe, a little bit cantankerous and didn't always get along with other players, including trumpet players. And he, in the classic ensemble of that period that we know as sort of a Dixieland band now, it would be a rhythm section, bass, piano, perhaps banjo, a drum set, small drum kit, and then 3 or 4 horn players, maybe a saxophone, but definitely a clarinet, trumpet, and trombone. And he was known to play incredibly loud on the clarinet, and then gradually switched over to primarily playing soprano sax, because that was yet a more powerful tool for him to play with. I can demonstrate sort of a little bit of this as I'm going to unblur myself here so that you can see the instruments better. Let's see, did we get that? Okay, so clarinet, which we know, which is more mellow sound, even in the upper register. Whereas soprano has an instrument that was invented in Germany, I believe, by Adolf saxophone in the mid 1800s, early 1800s, I believe, to play louder and to be able to play outside as well. And really adopted by American early jazz players and really like came to fruition. But so this is quite similar in size to the clarinet, also tuned in the key of B flat, but much more brilliant, bright sound, and obviously much more dominant. The other thing that I would say about Sidney Bechet is he was famous for his very wide and now considered slightly archaic vibrato that he used, both on clarinet and soprano. So it was a very, if I can do sort of an impression of it, and we'll be incorporating that to some extent while trying to keep it a little bit more modern as well.
Harry, is that the time we should also show the David actually doing the introduction of the Rhapsody in Blue that actually connects beautifully with the jazz influence in Ravel? Should we show that audio clip now?
Yeah, I think so, sure. That involves the classic glissando, which was obviously is utilized quite a bit amongst jazz players. Drew, I wanted to comment on something you said that was so interesting to me. This how this one phrase that felt that it just beautifully flowed, and yet was it Ravel that really struggled over
Writing it, yes, correct.
Writing it, and I think that made me think about this concept. I think perhaps a false concept of jazz players that are considered, well, they just make it up while they're going along. They're just making it up, and that is only, in my view, only slightly true. I believe that there just as much work and practice and working things out and struggling over their instruments and over what they want to play and what they want to write is really no different than classical players. I play classical music as well. It's just that in the performance is assembled in a different way. It's not written, but it's taken from all this material that's been struggled over in the proverbial woodshed. So I like that we have, especially in this program too, where we're putting all these disparate things together, there is so much common ground. And I think it's connecting those lines that we're sort of talking about today and what we're going to be presenting in a couple of weeks. Anyway,
Wonderful.
back to Angel.
Great. So just Mary, so we're going to listen actually to David with this incredible introduction in Rhapsody in Blue. And this is us post-classical ensemble in actually the original version of Rhapsody in Blue, which actually was written for the famous Paul Whiteman band. It's not the symphonic version, it's the big band version. So Mary, whenever you can, please.
I would just add, as Mary is getting things ready, I would just add to turn up your volume. Now's a good time to turn up your volume a little bit so that you can really capture it. But over to you, Mary.
That was our incredible David Jones with Post Classical Ensemble. Bravo! Great. So back to you, Harry.
That was so exciting and so much better than the way we hear it on, is it United Airlines? Yeah, no comparison at all. So, and that piece premiered in New York with the Paul Whiteman Orchestra at Aeolian Hall in February of 1925. And there was so much going on in that year. Louis Armstrong was making the first recordings with his Hot Five group. And so you had at the same time, you know, this kind of very symphonic jazz happening on the one hand, and a very hot improvised small group jazz at the same time, both of them making their way to Europe and just creating such excitement. And part of that was Josephine Baker, the incredible dancer, performer, singer, who came over to Paris as a very young woman, 19 years old, and performed semi-nude to great acclaim. She was exoticized, primitivized, wearing that banana skirt, objectified, and yet her personality or talent were such that she turned that into a very personal, original statement and a very successful career. Good for her. So we're going to see, not tonight, but during the concert, a few minutes of film. It's really the, I think, the best record of her dancing on film. It's from a not great film with Jean Gabin from the 1930s. But in the middle of this film, she just bursts out with a wonderful improvisation, polyrhythmic and humorous and sexy, and we're going to see that. So don't fall asleep. But really, moving farther backwards, we begin with another film or collaboration of film and dance and music that I want Angel to talk about, because it involves some very important music by Eric Satie. It's the made for the ballet Relâche, which literally means something like relax in French. And it was a production of the Swedish ballet. There were sort of two dominant, exciting ballet, avant-garde ballet companies in Paris at the time, the Ballet Russe with Diaghilev, and then the Swedish ballet with Rolf de Marais, the director there. And the Swedish ballet was edgier, more avant-garde, and they commissioned this work, a ballet involving some really contemporary looking movement, very ordinary kinds of movements, as far as we can tell from the reports. There's no film of it, unfortunately. Some radical sets, collaboration between René Clair, the filmmaker, Francis Picabia, the artist, Satie, the musician, and some major cameo appearances in this. So in this film, which comes in the middle of the ballet as a kind of intermission, we have a very important document, the first instance ever of a film music collaboration, which Satie scored and wrote the music frame by frame to the film by René Clair. And so we're going to have the amazing experience of seeing the film and hearing the music. And so in the film, we're going to show you a clip, and I'd love Angel to talk about what this experience is like. You've already been rehearsing it. It's going to be very, very exciting.
Excellent. So let's watch the clip before, and then just so that you realize how crazy these people were. So they clearly were out of their minds, which is very healthy to see nowadays. And you know, what was modernity at the time? What meant to be modern? Well, industry and machines was one important part of it. So as you hear, the music tries to imitate the sound of industry. The machine is kind of the reference there. So what Satie does is he kind of replicates that idea of with about repetitions, patterns. You heard the beginning of the what we played, taram, taram, bim pam, taram, param. So that kind of approach is the approach of Satie's score for the film. We're going to, as Harry said, it's going to be great. We're going to perform the music live with the images. It's it's going to be a fantastic experience doing that. So I just wanted to show you. I don't know. No, you cannot see the score. I had the score here, so that you saw. But anyway, it's not working. But in the score, you see the repeats constantly. The music is being repeated. It's played once and then repeated, and that actually is a very important thing in, and Drews will hopefully agrees with me, in Ravel's third movement. There is a lot of that, of these patterns. Just the beginning of the third movement is the, all the bass line, pim, pam, pam, pim, pam, pum, pam, pam. The piano is repeating, patterns constantly, and then the bass line is pam, 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 constantly. So, and this is actually the idea of the performance. What was in Ravel's life? What was in Ravel's mind in order to get to that extraordinary achievement, which is the concerto in G major? So that's what is going to happen on November 9th.
Mm-hmm. I'll just jump in on this your wonderful demonstration of repetition, and you were saying these people are out of their minds, which I love that. And there's something about repetition which is extremely shocking and subversive, because it goes against every idea of musical development, right? And all of our proper bourgeois, if you will, expectations about how something should evolve musically, and instead we're confronted with this. It's very mechanical, certainly, and you could also say it's very primitivizing, because anytime you have a repeated beat, especially in percussion at this era, you're referring to jazz, you're referring to blues kind of music, African rhythms that are coming through this colonial empire called France. So you have machine and primitivism coming together, and shocking everybody and making everyone laugh too. And I think laughter is appropriate. I love seeing that was Marcel Duchamp on the left and Man Ray on the right, two of the great artists of this moment of transition from Dada into surrealism, playing chess. I love it when Duchamp said, sticks his tongue out, and they're just having a lot of fun with it. So it's shocking and it's fun, and at the same time, and I think that's not easy. That's not easy to pull off. So it's going to be a very very exciting, I think, to hear that. And yeah, and Picabia, he's not present there, but he was the artist and the person who wrote and directed the ballet and parts of the film. And he had been in New York during World War I, and did paintings called Negro Song, you know, visited clubs in Harlem. So there's all these crossovers going back and forth that we're just suggesting. We're not even going to trace. It's not a history lesson, but yeah, evoking it. So we have reached now pretty much the beginning of the program. So you can all take your seats now. And I'm not sure what time it is, but I know we wanted to take some questions. Michelle, would this be a good time to do
Absolutely,
that?
absolutely. We have a few minutes for questions. We'd
Okay.
love to grab one. I don't have any questions popping up right now, but y'all think about what you might want to ask any of our guests tonight. And I'll kick it off with a question that just came to mind, and I will direct it to Angel, but anybody can answer it. You mentioned the machine, and Harry mentioned the machine, the primitivism of the repeated sound. Angel, is this a foreshadowing of minimalism? Because there does seem to be, speak to that.
Absolutely. I mean, there is no doubt of that many composers take over from this. Copland, some of you remember that we actually re-recorded the music of the city, the famous, the beautiful 1939 documentary. That was 1939, so we are talking about 15 years later. And Copland takes this clearly in the use of that. And then and later, of course, minimalism is about patterns and repeating, which is, as Harry said, also a sign of, you know, this primitivism that is in the repetition too. It's not just, and also I'm glad, Harry, you mentioned the part of humor, because this is so important in this. Also in Ravel, isn't it true? This beautiful, this Mediterranean flavor that is, I mean, the
That is
humor
great.
of this.
Charm, like it's
Yes, the
beyond
charm, the
the
French charm.
charm, this kind of
Wit
nuance.
and wit, esprit.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
You know, speaking of minimalism, it's also minimalism in dance,
Mhm.
simple movements. And we saw that this amazing shot through glass of the ballerina, who later turns out to be a bearded lady,
Yeah.
jumping up and down, just up and down, up and down. And it's so defamiliarizing, not only the
Yes.
angle, but just to see that we begin to analyze that movement, every muscle, and it's really so much of really the 20th century is right there in a remarkable way.
I have a question from the audience, and this may be for the musicians in the crowd, well, all of them. We have so many. Can you talk about the use of harmonics in jazz scales, and Ravel's use of them in the concerto? How it accentuates the concerto's jazz sound?
David, do you want to start talking a little bit about that, and then I can mention?
Well, I think that, I mean, I think we're talking about sort of a further development of the harmonic language. And Ravel, I would venture to say, and I was thinking about it, Harry, when you talked about the tune "I Loves You, Porgy" from Porgy and Bess, where he begins that it's all in thirds, and do 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 do, these sort of extended harmonies that go the root, third, fifth, seventh, and the ninth.
Right.
And I think that Ravel is using that kind of language, which gives it that much more modern, modern sound. I think we see sometimes fourths stacked on one another, which is probably even more progressive than what Sidney Bechet and those were doing. But I mean, that's really my discussion of harmony. We do see that, yeah, that we're expanding beyond more traditional, earlier European Western music, I suppose.
We see some like octatonic scale, so that's 8-note scale instead of 7.
Oh, yes.
There's the pentatonics always in this kind of French music, but they're raised and lowered scale degrees. So if the scale is usually, if we can hear this, sometimes he'll do things like we'll throw in a couple others, or the famous Rhapsody in Blue kind of illusion where he'll do. I mean, what would be more traditional would be to do. I mean, this is a fourth, not so traditional, but more in the scale. This is not in a scale. So this sort of thing is going on a lot in the G major here. He also does a little bit of white key, black key dissonances, where the opening for the piano is this G major chord, and then on top of it is a kind of pentatonic light 4-note version. So you get this really kind of grating this thing, but in the context with the piccolo and the flute playing, it's actually very colorful and it sparkles. I mean, composers before Ravel would have done things like this, but when you add these other distances, this sort of thing is going on too.
There is no doubt that we are in front of one of the most extraordinary orchestrators in the history of music. I mean, Ravel is a master of colors, what Drew mentioned, the structures. I mean, for those of you that are not familiar with the term of harmonic, in music we differentiate between natural sounds and artificial sounds. So harmonics are mostly produced by string instruments, and it's this kind of ethereal sound that you hear in a very high register. And in this concerto, in the most extraordinary moments, Ravel uses that in the strings with harmonics, and you will see this ethereal sound. And the harp also produces those beautiful harmonics. So come to the performance.
I will just add, from what I know of the saxophone, that and the way Adolf Sax developed it is that the saxophone sound is full of harmonics, more than a lot of woodwinds, and I think we could hear it just when David really started playing out. It's the saxophone resonates with itself, and it gets this amazing richness of sound. Is that on target, David? Oh, you're muted.
The primary difference between clarinet and saxophone is only superficially the material. There are metal clarinets that were made in the early 20th century in the United States, I think, because they didn't crack and they were, the wood. But you could, you play them and they sound just like clarinets. The timbre is essentially the same. The difference between the saxophone and the clarinet is the bore is in the clarinet, the bore is cylindrical, so it's essentially the same dimensions on both ends, and rather than the saxophone, which is conical, so that the mouthpiece end is much narrower than the bell, and that produces an entirely different sound. I believe basically all brass instruments are also conical bores as well. So there's a parallel between the brass instruments and soprano sax. And I think that contributes to at least a very different set of harmonic series and timbre quality, being the potential for having a lot more overtones and a much brighter sound as well.
Fantastic. We have one more question that's come in, and I think I'll pose this and then give everybody maybe a minute to comment on it, and then we can conclude for the evening. But here's the question with an introduction. Paris had so much rhythm at the time with Stravinsky and the Ballet Russe, to the influence of jazz and the historical French irreverence for structure. How do all these come out in Satie and Ravel? A thought from someone? A couple of thoughts?
The question is I'm curious about this historical irreverence of the French for structure. I think they're plenty structured. Debussy certainly was obsessive, and Ravel also, but maybe in the sense that not in the same way the Austro-German tradition was. That's definitely true. And subversive. I mean, look, the French were innovators. They were definitely onto the latest and greatest, and Paris was really a hotbed for a long time before the 1920s. I mean, you go back to the 1820s, it was always, for a long time, this kind of revolutionary capital, both artistically and also politically. So I think a lot of that has to do with that heritage, and that kind of the history has a lot to do with what we now have to work with and explore. But I forgot the rest of the question. Maybe someone else can answer the other part.
No worries. Any other final thoughts? Okay.
I think Drew, explained it beautifully. I mean, back to Satie, what we mentioned about, so the idea of a structure is precisely not having a structure of, repeating and repeating and repeating. And this idea, which is, I like very much what Harry said about the subversion of being repetitive. There is an emphasis in being, in imposing. It's a part of an imposition. So in that sense, I would say the structure in Satie is precisely that. This patterns, this repetition of everything.
Yeah, I would agree that with Drew, I don't know about irreverence for structure. Maybe it's a different structure, different ideas of structure, but certainly irreverence. I would sign on to that as a description of the entire program. It's irreverence epitomized.
Yes.
We embrace it. We absolutely embrace it. And with that note, I think we shall conclude this evening. I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, for all of you spending this last hour with us. We so appreciate you. Thank you to our participants tonight. Thank you for your comments, your thoughts, your feedbacks. It's just been such a delightful evening. And there's more, right? Because we still have a concert on the 9th. And all of you will be invited to a post-concert discussion where we can ask more questions. Those questions that you didn't get answered tonight, you can answer them on November 9th. You can get them answered on November 9th. Remember to follow us on social media so you can be updated when the latest news comes out, when this the recording will be posted on the website. You'll get all of that information. And with that, I want to wish you all a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you very, very soon. Good night, everybody.